There is an enormous amount written about what grief is, about its stages, its arc, its ultimate destination in meaning and acceptance, and the hard-won wisdom that suffering can eventually become. And then there is the part that gets written about far less. What do you actually do on a Tuesday at 2 p.m. when the grief hits and you are supposed to be functioning? What do you do with your body when it won't stop shaking, or when it has gone completely numb and you are terrified of the difference? What do you do when you walk into the grocery store and a song comes on and suddenly you are not in the grocery store anymore, you are somewhere else entirely, and the grief has arrived without warning in the bread aisle? That is the gap this video is filling. Not the theory of grief. We have another video on David Kessler's stages and meaning-making framework, linked in the description if you want it. This video is about the lived experience of grief, the body of it, the hours of it, the specific hard moments of it, and what David Kessler, who has spent decades sitting with grieving people, who lost his own son, who knows this territory from the inside as well as from the clinical chair, says actually helps. This is for you if you are in it right now. It is for therapists who sit with grieving clients and want specific, grounded psychoeducation tools to offer them. And it is for anyone supporting a grieving person who wants to understand what is actually helpful and what, with the best intentions, is not. The David Kessler Grief Cheat Sheet is linked in the description. Let's get into it. Section 1. Grief lives in the body. First, one of the most important and least discussed dimensions of grief is that it is a somatic experience before it is a cognitive one. Grief does not live primarily in your thoughts, though the thoughts are relentless. It lives in your body, in the physical weight of it, the fatigue that goes beyond anything sleep resolves, the chest tightness that can feel frightening, the loss of appetite, or the inability to stop eating, the immune suppression, the way the body moves differently when someone central to your world is no longer in it. David Kessler is explicit about this. Grief is one of the most physically demanding experiences the human body undergoes. The stress response activated by loss, the sustained elevation of cortisol, the disruption of sleep architecture, the impact on the cardiovascular and immune systems, is measurable, significant, and chronically underestimated by a culture that treats grief primarily as an emotional and cognitive event. What this means practically is that tending to the body during grief is not a secondary concern or a form of self-indulgence. It is a clinical priority. The body that is not being fed, rested, moved, or cared for, even minimally, does not have the physiological resources to process the emotional work of grief. Kessler is pragmatic on this point. You do not have to feel like eating. You do not have to feel like sleeping. But the body needs these things regardless of what you feel. And meeting those needs is one of the most fundamental acts of care available to someone in grief. For therapists, asking about sleep, appetite, movement, and physical sensation in grieving clients is not peripheral to the work. It is often the most direct access point to where the grief is actually being held, and the most immediate place where practical intervention can reduce the physiological load enough to make the emotional work possible. Section 2. The wave model. Surviving the surges. One of Kessler's most practically useful frameworks, and one that grieving people consistently describe as the most immediately relieving thing they encounter, is the wave model of grief. Grief does not arrive in a steady, manageable stream that you process incrementally until it is done. It arrives in waves, unpredictable, often poorly timed, sometimes overwhelmingly large, and sometimes confusingly absent when you expected them. The wave can arrive in the grocery store, in a meeting, at 3 a.m, in the middle of a laugh. It can be triggered by a song, a smell, a date on the calendar, a stranger's gesture that reminded you of the person you lost. It can arrive 2 years after the loss, on an ordinary day, with all the force of the first week. Understanding grief as waves, rather than as a linear progression that should be moving toward resolution, changes everything about how you relate to the surges. When grief is expected to be linear, to diminish steadily and predictably, each wave feels like regression, like failure, like evidence that you are not healing or that you are doing grief wrong. When grief is understood as waves, the surge can be named for what it is, not regression, not permanent, not a sign that anything has gone wrong. A wave, which will peak and which will recede. Kessler's practical guidance for the wave in real time is simple and important. Don't fight it. The attempt to suppress or outrun a grief wave does not make it smaller. It makes it more disruptive when it eventually breaks through. The practice is to let the wave come, to find a safe place to feel it if possible, to allow it to move through rather than bottling it behind a wall that will eventually crack. The wave is not your enemy. It is the grief doing what grief does, moving through the system in search of an exit. Section 3. Permission. The most underrated grief skill. 430 to 600. If David Kessler has one message that runs through everything he has written and said about grief, it is this: you have permission to grieve exactly as you are grieving. This sounds simple. It is not simple because the world surrounding a grieving person is typically full of implicit and explicit messages about how grief should look, how long it should last, and what it means about the griever when it doesn't conform to those expectations. You should be further along by now. You seem to be doing so well, which is meant as a compliment, but lands as a pressure. At least they lived a good life. At least you had the time you had. You need to move on, for your own sake. These messages, however well-intentioned, communicate that the grief is inconvenient, excessive, or a problem to be managed. And the grieving person, already exhausted, typically has two options: perform wellness they don't feel, or feel shame about the grief they do feel. Neither is healing. Both are additional burdens laid on top of an already crushing load. Kessler's framework offers a direct antidote. Grief is not a problem. It is love with nowhere to go. The grief is proportional to the love, and the love was real, and it mattered, and it deserves to be honored, not managed away on a culturally acceptable schedule. Permission in practice means permission to cry when the grief arrives, even in inconvenient places. Permission to not be okay at social events. Permission to talk about the person you lost, to say their name, to bring them into conversation rather than treating their mention as a violation of someone else's comfort. Permission to have a bad day a year out, or 3 years out, or 10. And, equally important, permission to have a good day without guilt. To laugh at something without it being a betrayal. To feel a moment of genuine peace without needing to immediately check whether you should still be suffering. For therapists, offering explicit permission in the room, naming that whatever the client is feeling is allowed, that there is no grief they can bring in here that is too much or too little or incorrectly timed, is one of the most powerful things available in grief work. Permission is therapeutic before any technique is applied. Section 4. Grief triggers and how to navigate them. Grief triggers are one of the aspects of loss that grieving people are least prepared for and most destabilized by, not because the grief they produce is necessarily more intense than other moments, but because they arrive without warning in the middle of ordinary life, making the world feel unpredictable and the grief feel inescapable. A grief trigger is any sensory, environmental, relational, or temporal cue that activates the grief response. Dates, anniversaries, birthdays, holidays are the most obvious and the most anticipated. But the more disruptive triggers are the unexpected ones. The song that played at a particular moment, the physical smell of someone's home, a phone screen lighting up with a name that will never call again. The automatic movement of reaching for a phone to tell someone something, and arriving at the remembrance. Kessler's approach to grief triggers is not avoidance, which is both practically impossible and therapeutically counterproductive, but preparation and compassionate navigation. This means, practically, knowing your triggers and giving yourself advance permission to be affected by them. Planning around the major dates, not to avoid feeling, but to have support available. To be in an environment that allows for feeling. To not schedule the performance review or the difficult conversation on the anniversary of the loss. Telling the people close to you what the triggers are so they can offer informed support rather than confusion when a moment arrives without apparent cause. It also means developing a relationship with the trigger that is oriented toward meaning rather than purely toward pain management. Kessler speaks about the trigger as a portal, a moment when the love breaks through the ordinary surface of a day and makes its presence known. The song is not only painful, the song is connection. The smell is not only loss, the smell is the person, still present in sense memory, still real. This is not a reframe that erases the pain. It is a reframe that allows the pain and the love to coexist in the same moment, which is, ultimately, what living with loss requires. Section 5. What not to do. The traps that prolong suffering. Kessler is characteristically direct about the behaviors that, with entirely understandable motivation, make grief harder rather than easier to move through. Not as judgment. He is constitutionally incapable of judgment toward grieving people, but as practical guidance grounded in what he has witnessed across decades of work. The first trap is isolation. The pull toward solitude in grief is real and sometimes necessary. Quiet and privacy, to feel what needs to be felt, are legitimate needs. But chronic isolation in grief, particularly social isolation from people who knew and loved the person you lost, removes the relational context in which grief most naturally moves. Grief is, at its heart, a relational wound, the rupture of a bond that mattered, and it heals, imperfectly and non-linearly, in relationship. The people who will say the person's name, who remember them, who can share in the specific texture of the loss, their presence is not a distraction from grieving. It is part of the grieving. The second trap is comparison grief, the measuring of one's grief against others' grief to determine whether one's own is justified. My loss isn't as bad as theirs. At least I had more time. At least it wasn't sudden. At least. Kessler is firm. Grief is not a competition, and loss does not have a minimum threshold for deserving to be grieved. Your grief is not diminished by someone else's being different or apparently larger. The loss you are mourning is the loss you are mourning. And it is enough, exactly as it is, to warrant the full weight of what you are feeling. The third trap is what Kessler calls grief on a timeline. The internalized belief, often reinforced by the people around you, that grief has a reasonable duration after which it should be substantially resolved. Grief does not work on a calendar. Complicated grief, delayed grief, grief that resurfaces years after apparent resolution. These are not pathological, except in their most extreme clinical expressions. They are the natural behavior of love encountering loss. Releasing the timeline, or more precisely, releasing the shame that accumulates when the timeline isn't met, is one of the most liberating things a grieving person can do for themselves. And the fourth trap is the suppression of secondary losses, the downstream losses that flow from the primary one and that are often under-acknowledged and under-grieved. The loss of a partner is also the loss of a financial structure, a social identity, a daily routine, a future that was assumed. The loss of a parent is also the loss of a particular kind of being known, of the person who held the earliest memories, of the buffer between you and your own mortality. Grieving the primary loss without space for the secondary ones leaves enormous grief territory unaddressed. And that unaddressed territory has a way of making itself known. Section 6. Tending to yourself without bypassing the pain. There is a fine and important line between self-care in grief and spiritual bypass, between genuinely tending to yourself during the hardest season of your life and using wellness activities to avoid the grief that needs to be felt. Kessler navigates this distinction with more precision than almost anyone in the field. Self-care in grief is not about feeling better. It is about maintaining enough physiological and psychological stability to be able to feel at all, to stay in relationship with the grief, rather than being either overwhelmed by it or insulated from it. The walk is not taken because it resolves the grief. It is taken because the body in movement processes emotion differently than the body in stillness, and because grief needs the nervous system to have enough regulated capacity to move the emotional material through. Kessler's specific guidance includes the practice of what he calls grief doses, intentional, bounded periods of allowing yourself to fully enter the grief, followed by a deliberate return to ordinary functioning. This is not avoidance of the grief in the intervals. It is the recognition that grief cannot be lived at full intensity every moment of every day, and that the rhythm of entering and returning is itself a healthy and necessary one. You can be in grief and also make dinner. You can be in grief and also laugh at something. You can be in grief and also, some mornings, feel something that is not grief at all. And none of that means the grief is less real or the love was less. Connection to the person lost is another dimension of grief self-care that Kessler advocates for with particular warmth, the continuation of the relationship in a different form. Talking to them, writing to them, visiting the places that held them, engaging in the activities they loved. This is not denial of the loss. It is one of the primary ways that grief eventually transforms into something that can be carried alongside a continuing life rather than in opposition to it. The bond does not have to be severed. It changes form, and tending to the changed form of the bond is tending to the grief. The David Kessler Grief Cheat Sheet in the description holds all of the key frameworks from his body of work, including the concepts from this video, in one organized, compassionate, clinically useful reference. It's there when you need it. Grief is not a problem to be solved. It is a love to be honored. In the body, in the hours of the day, in the waves that arrive without warning, in the triggers that break open the ordinary surface of a Tuesday and remind you that someone who mattered is gone. There is no right way to do this. There is no timeline that marks you as on track or behind. There is only you and the loss and the love that is still entirely real, even though it has nowhere left to go in the ways it used to. And the slow, non-linear, often interrupted work of finding new places for it to go. David Kessler has spent his life sitting with people in this place. What he has learned, and what he offers to anyone willing to receive it, is not comfort that bypasses the pain. It is the kind of company that goes into it with you. The kind that says, your grief is not too much. Your love was real. And you are going to find, when you are ready, that the grief and the love and even the meaning can coexist in the same life. The cheat sheet is in the description. And if this video helped you feel less alone in what you are carrying today, share it with someone else who is carrying it too. I'll see you in the next one.